and welcome to Hospice Insights, the Law and Beyond, where we connect you to what matters in the ever-changing world of hospice and palliative care. A refresh. What's new in the new OIG General Compliance Program Guidance? Josie, Natasha, thank you for joining me. This is a first time for us doing a podcast, so very exciting. Thanks for taking the time.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
So I put new in the title twice for a reason, because it's like I'm enthusiastic. It's new, right? Because at least for hospices, there hasn't been new compliance program guidance since 1999. So, and I know this isn't specific to hospices, but that's foreshadowing that there's going to be an update to that. But, let's sort of start out. What are we looking at here? Because this is general OIG compliance guidance. So is this for everyone in the healthcare industry then?
Yes, it's for all individuals and entities involved in the healthcare industry. And this is also part of the new aspect of it. We haven't had a general compliance program guidance before. And as you mentioned, Meg, we are going to get industry-specific guidances coming starting this year. We expect one for hospice. It is not among the first 4 that have been announced thus far, though.
Yeah. And I mean, it will be interesting. I'm sure we'll do a podcast when that comes out. I feel like there's so much that's new, but then also sort of the same old traps that the government was concerned about, 25 years ago. So, Natasha, as we look at this compliance guidance, what are the big takeaways here? Because it's, as you said, a very lengthy document. So, what's the distillation? What's the upshot here?
Yeah, I think there's, a couple of different things here. I think the main thing is, as always, the government is concerned with fraud, waste, and abuse. And that's been since, the dawn of time. But I think what we're seeing in this guidance is a more sort of proactive and sort of holistic approach to compliance. That sort of concept of things start from the top and roll down. So everybody needs to be involved. Everybody in your company needs to understand, what do we need to do to be in compliance for our particular, company and what we do.
And I've always said compliance is everyone's problem. And you said it in a much kinder way. But I mean, I do think for a while now, it's not just the compliance officer's job, because, you don't have a great compliance program. If you ask, have you ever gotten any complaints? And they're like, no, we haven't. We're doing a great job. And that means well, no one's filing any complaints. You've never gotten a hotline call because no one knows about it, or they don't feel comfortable raising things. And so I think that whole living, breathing compliance program, which I think really important part comes in terms of what is your audit plan and stuff, because that's a lot of the stuff you're doing every single year, or even more frequently revamping what you're looking at in terms of risk areas. But I guess, why do you think the OIG came out with this now, as opposed to, as you said, since the dawn of time, they've cared about fraud, waste, and abuse. Why now? Is it just they're getting around to it, or what do you think the rationale is?
Well, that certainly could be true, that they're just getting around to it being a government entity. But no, I think what we're seeing is more complicated business structures. We're seeing more regulations that need to be complied with. We're seeing a lot of new technology, which changes the way that these healthcare entities function. Things like value-based care, which we're seeing a lot of in the Medicare space right now, the private equity and other folks getting into the healthcare industry. So I think there's so many more new players, different types of business structures, that there needs to be sort of almost like an overhaul of what does compliance look like.
So Josie, when our hospice listeners are hearing this, they're thinking about the 1999 program guidance, and everyone's program guidance has the 7 elements. Everyone knows what those 7 elements are, but maybe you just rehash those briefly. What are the 7 elements of an effective compliance program? And are those the same ones that are in here or not?
Right. The 7 elements they map pretty closely onto the elements from the 1999 hospice guidance. There are some nuances that we'll talk about, but the 7 elements are: number 1 is written policies and procedures. Number 2 is compliance, leadership, and oversight. Number 3 is training and education. Number 4 is effective lines of communication with the compliance officer. Number 5 is enforcing standards. So that's talking about consequences and incentives. Number 6 is risk assessment, auditing, and monitoring. And number 7 is responding to detected offenses and developing corrective action. So that should sound pretty familiar to everybody in the hospice world. Like I said, it maps pretty closely onto the prior guidance, but there are some important differences, and I think they reflect that more holistic approach that Natasha mentioned earlier. Some of the new areas of emphasis or greater areas of emphasis are keeping policies current, board responsibility for oversight of compliance, general compliance training for everybody, plus targeted training for groups who need specific instruction and education on particular areas related to their job functions. Not just consequences like discipline, but also incentives. And that could come in the form of maybe even some additional compensation, recognition if appropriate. We know we can't always recognize people who report, or just other creative strategies. And one area I'd really like to mention is there's a new emphasis on conducting formal risk assessments. Risk assessments are barely mentioned in the old guidance, but I think they're critically important because they're foundational. You need to formally evaluate what your compliance risks are for a variety of reasons. You want to make sure you're not missing anything. You want to make sure you're looking internally at what has actually been happening in your organization, but also looking externally at things that might be changing. Like Natasha mentioned, there's a fast pace of change in regulations themselves, and also regulatory focuses of agencies and things like that. You also need to do that to prioritize your compliance efforts. We've a lot of times done this risk assessment process in our heads, or we've done it on paper or in a committee and kind of talked it out. But doing it formally means really putting a structure in place to make sure we're looking externally and internally and learning from the past and the present. They mentioned using an enterprise risk management approach to formal risk assessments, and that is just a very holistic and comprehensive way of looking at risk, and you can apply that to compliance risk as well. There are resources linked to in the guidance that point to some things that you can use some tools to adopt an enterprise risk management approach specifically for compliance risks. There's also some new areas of focus beyond the 7 elements. So quality of care and patient safety as potential indicators of compliance concerns. Like Natasha mentioned, new entrants to the healthcare sector and changes in ownership and financial arrangements.
I'm just hearing this as you're going through this, Josie, and it's just really frustrating in the climate right now for hospice, and there's so much enforcement, and I feel like as an industry, we feel like there's a real disconnect because, I'm just thinking of so many of our clients who, their PEPA report shows they're not an outlier and they're doing well from a data perspective, and they have a great compliance program, and then you're still getting targeted for a lot of scrutiny by the government over length of stay or something. And it's, and obviously compliance programs are much broader than just, payment issues. But it just is, I think, really frustrating when there's a disconnect between, enforcement. Now, that enforcement is not, quote, fraud, right? I mean, we're not talking about false claim risk. It's just payment risk. But when, people are taking back millions of dollars by, Monday morning quarterbacking and second guessing eligibility, it's, I think, really frustrating. So anyway, because you do get points for having a compliance program under the sentencing guidelines and other things, and so you hope never to have to, issue that card.
Yes.
And obviously, it doesn't really come up in the audits that we're working on, because I feel like you could show a very effective compliance program. It doesn't really make a lick of difference, but. So I think something that's really important that you both of you have talked about is the role of the board. And I think that that's been a drumbeat for a while now, because there were two reports that I think the OIG put out in collaboration with the American Health Lawyers Association about the importance of healthcare boards being engaged and have a good knowledge base and understanding that, and I think how that translates in the not, for profit, but also not for profit sector is, yes, you want a community board, but they need to be conversant in healthcare, even if they don't work in healthcare. And that's not like the nuts and bolts of everything, but I think appreciate the highly regulated area in which hospices work in. And so I think a lot of board education, and I think a lot of our clients are doing that, but interesting that they continue to put a great emphasis on that. And so anything else interesting about board engagement with compliance?
Yeah, that I just wanted to add to that as you were talking about that. One of the issues that's come up a lot, I see it a lot, is the question of whether legal and compliance can be the same person, especially with smaller companies that don't, have a lot of money. They don't have a lot of sort of working capital. And there's been thoughts both ways on this. The federal government in this particular guidance says, no, they really need to be separate. And not only that, but the compliance officer really should be reporting directly to the board, which means the board, as you say, Meg, needs to really understand what risk looks like for your company and sort of how to create a risk assessment and a compliance program.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And I think that like everyone, that's evolved for our hospice clients over time. And I think our, clients are doing it the best. They have for a long time had a direct line where the compliance officer, if they're doing quarterly reports to the board or whatever. Now, this doesn't mean the board is micromanaging, right? The board's function is never to micromanage, but they need to know like enough about what's going on and why it's important, and because it's not no news is good news, right? Like, and I think also not self-serving maybe isn't the right language, but I think when you do, good board education, regular board education, when these things happen, like if you do have a complaint, people aren't freaking out because it's like, well, this is compliance in action. This is what we want to have happen. This is what we expect to have happen. And then we work our process. Like we do the internal investigation. We do this, we do that. And also that you need to spend money on this. And so having a third party come and do an assessment, every year of your, compliance program or whatever that is. I mean, I think that board's appreciation for the environment, which is highly regulated, lots of enforcement, lots of government audits, those things are to be expected. It's also to be expected that we do have sometimes complaints. We might need to make repayments to the government affirmatively. I mean, all of those things aren't, my hair's on fire things, right? Those are things that I think if you educate your board well, they will not obviously be concerned and want to know, at a high level what's going on, but they're not going to be like, oh, we're doing something wrong because these events happen, because we're still humans caring for humans and humans make mistakes and whatnot. So interesting that they continue that line that is very important for board involvement and separation between legal and compliance. I think the old adage we've had has always been a compliance program shouldn't be on the shelf, right? That like, oh, I paid a consultant to do this,
Yes.
and look at it there. And, that's 25 years ago, we were saying that still seems to be, very much an emphasis in this new guidance, right? Is like, this
Yes.
needs to be living and breathing. And so the fact that 25 years later, they're still saying stuff like this shows that still must be a problem for many people. So I think obviously having that accountability within the organization, like the CEO appreciates that, the board appreciates that, the board expects certain things, that we're doing auditing, we're doing this stuff. But other practical pointers, because I know, Josie, you've been looking at a lot of compliance program plans recently. So what are you seeing that's sort of a problem for people in terms of, they're trying to do it right, but it's not the holistic enterprise. What's another word we were saying? Proactive,
Right.
model. Like, what are you
Yes.
seeing in practice?
A big challenge is exactly what you were just talking about, is that you have to really make it workable. It has to be real. It can't just be on the shelf. It can't just be on paper. So first step I would say is check out the new guidance. Make sure you're doing at least the key things for each of the 7 elements. And the new guidance does have a section that talks about how smaller organizations can adapt each of these 7 elements. So check out that section in particular. I would also say routinely review your compliance-related policies and procedures to make sure you're actually doing what you say that you're doing. And if there's a disconnect between what's written on the paper and what you're actually doing, don't necessarily assume that more education is going to fix the problem. It could be that the policies and procedures themselves are unusable, unworkable, or confusing, just too much maybe. So your goal is to design the policies and procedures in a way that makes them, number 1, easy to use. Number 2, they fit the day-to-day workflows of the people who use them. And number 3, of course, achieves your compliance goals. I'd rather see a small but usable set of compliance-related policies and procedures than a gigantic handbook of really long, overly complicated policies and procedures that are ignored, really, because they're too hard to use. They're too hard to use. So,
I couldn't agree more. I think that's a really, really important point, Josie, because I think that people think like, I'll get the gold star because it's big and it's like has a pretty binder with a nice binding on the side. And it's really not about that. I mean, I think everyone sort of knows that, but more complex isn't better. And I think another thing that you said, which is great, which is education overload, is education is important, but people are getting thrown a lot of stuff. And like, we're also struggling with staff turnover and, staff engagement, and we're moving to value-based care. So people are getting, a lot of pressure in lots of different ways. So you got to sort of pick, right? This is reality, not the perfect world. And so what's most important, and like picking and choosing. And, even like, I remember this is probably too old school now, but like people would send out compliance tips via email, like short little chunks, instead of I'm going to do a 2-hour compliance session and then you don't ever test people's knowledge either. It's like, okay, I dated through 2 hours of compliance training. There's no post-test. There's no retention. And I think, too, what you said is tailoring to people's jobs. Like not everyone needs, we talked about that with HIPAA too. It's like not everyone needs to know everything. And so, compliance, quote, is everyone's problem, but it's like, to what degree, right? And so I think, the person who answers your phone, maybe needs to know, like, right, if there's certain government officials that come to the office, if they're, there's certain things that even that person from a compliance standpoint needs to know, but that's very different than the stuff like your marketers who are going out and meeting with vendors, and they might get paid incentive comp for something like the kind of compliance program they need to have training is, going to look very different. And so I think those are really, really excellent points, Josie. Hard stuff. That's the thing. It's like, maybe I'm just now getting to the age where like, oh yeah, that's so like, it's new, but really old and nothing has really changed. Because I feel like it's sort of deja vu talking about some of the stuff that it's not, this isn't rocket science. Like I've never heard this before, but it sounds like maybe bringing it to the next level is dusting it off and making, it, as you said, integrated within the organization is maybe the key, that it's not just the compliance department and stuff like that. And so it is challenging times from a compliance officer perspective, but I guess any other practical points as we close out here, Josie, that you've seen in practice?
Yeah, one thing, and I think this again goes with making your program really effective, really making it holistic and integrated, is not just looking at outcomes, like when you're doing auditing and things like that, but also process improvement. So not just, do we have all the required documentation? Do we have the election statements, the certifications of terminal illness, et cetera, but how can we improve our admission processes to more consistently and seamlessly achieve those goals? What can we do to make it flow, to make it work well, and to just be effective every time a little bit more easily? How can you make people's jobs on a day-to-day basis easier in a way that's going to facilitate the day-to-day work of compliance and staying in compliance with all of the many obligations that we have? So it's taking a step backward. It's not just looking at the end result. That's important too, and that will inform what you're going to do for process improvement, what you're going to prioritize, but really just kind of take a step back. What are you concerned about? How can you make it better? How can you make it easier? How can you make it actually work? I think that's the big theme for this new compliance program guidance. It's how do you make it work?
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Josie. And I think that people are really trying to latch onto technology to solve every single problem for them. And obviously, as I'm thinking about, boxes people don't check on election forms and, all of these the parade of horribles we deal with, I think technology can be an aid in certain areas, but I don't think you should always just reach for the technology component. And also, I think taking that fresh eyes approach, and I think great example with the election form, because as we all know, folks had to retool that a couple of years ago. And when you take a step back, you look like, oh my gosh, my election form got so massive. It's solving, different problems than it was intended to solve, right? Like you threw a bunch of stuff that's not required in this document. And then you had people, have initial like every line of the document. And it's like, why are you doing that? Why are you having people sign multiple places on a document that they can just sign once? I think it's also that small stuff, but that can be really meaningful improvement that's going to enhance compliance. But when you also talk about workflow, maybe you're going to actually make people's lives easier. And when staff are feeling like I'm spending more time with documentation and less time with patients, like when you can streamline things, get higher compliance, higher quality, and have more, staff engagement and less burnout, because I'm having to deal with paperwork all the time. I mean, it's going to be a win-win. But even if you can't retool everything all at once, it's just like take really important things based on your risk assessment and bite off what you can chew, because it's the same thing with survey citations, and people write plans of correction and they overdo, they overpromise. And it's like, that's not about the gold star. It's like, you could do this other stuff and that might be nice once you could do like the baseline stuff, right? So I think it's like, you don't need to have, super whatever is after gold star, platinum star or something, right? Like, just begin and take fresh eyes to different things that you're doing. So I think really well said, Josie. I guess any other closing thoughts? This is really helpful. And I should put a plug in that we have links to the new guidance. We also have a link to the blog post you all wrote, and then links to some of the historical guidance too. But I guess any other closing thoughts?
I have just one sort of thought as you were talking, Meg. So first and foremost, I think, the regulators are not, although I'm sure some people may feel differently, I don't think they're, out there to sort of get everybody. I think that one of the important pieces is really when these regulators, from what I've seen in working with some of these folks, to clean up some kind of an issue that's going on, is what have you been doing? Are you just sort of sitting back and doing nothing, or are you actually trying to make your compliance program, better? And one of the ways to do that is to look at a lot of the resources that these regulators have. So in this guidance towards the end, there are a ton of links to these resources. And I really urge folks to take a look at those. Again, you don't have to memorize, as you say, no one's memorizing a 90-page document like this one. It's long, it's tedious, but I think understanding what the thought process is from the regulator's perspective is one of the key elements to being able to work with them when there is, some kind of issue that comes up, because inevitably there will be an issue that will come up.
Yeah. The bigger you get, the more problems you have, which again isn't a sign that you're doing something bad. It's just like humans make problems, like humans make errors or bad judgments or, whatever it may be. So, I do think whatever, most organizations are larger than they were 25 years ago. And so you wouldn't have the same compliance program. And so I think, this needs to be, as you grow, a bigger and bigger sort of part of what you do. And you don't always need to reinvent the wheel, though, because there are a lot of resources. And again, not that consultants can't be helpful, but just don't go buy something. You have to understand what it is that you're doing and why you're doing it, and that it's tailored to you, because it's not really a check the box thing. It's trying to have, results and hopefully, achieve these other things, which is make your staff, as you said, Josie, make their life easier in some respects. This isn't more always red tape. It actually could, looking and questioning, why are we doing something? Because we did this way for 25 years should not be the answer, right?
Mm-hmm,
so,
right.
But anyway, well, helpful stuff here. Thanks so much for your time, and we have a link to those helpful things you all gathered and prepared. So thanks for sharing those. And I look forward to next time. Who knows? Sometimes they say hospice, even though it's high on enforcement priorities, I doubt is going to, like you said, be in the first tranche of, program guidance. My guess is it will be, other provider types. So maybe we'll be talking in, a year, or it could be 5 years. Who knows? I guess in 5 years, maybe I'll be like out on a beach with a pina colada, and you guys will be doing this podcast by yourself or something. But anyway, thanks again for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having us, Meg. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Well, that's it for today's episode of Hospice Insights, The Law and Beyond. Thank you for joining the conversation. To subscribe to our podcast, visit our website at hushblackwell.com or sign up wherever you get your podcasts. until next time, may the wind be at your back.